chapter 2 today, and chapter 2 is all about, we start at the beginning with like the roots of how our country was founded and why a lot of the people in America are the way they are, and then we'll move forward with our grievances with Great Britain, and then we'll talk about a little, like the Constitution and creating a new government and the great experiment of democracy in the world that's still going on today. So, Americans, for the most part, we really were faithful British subjects. Like, even up until 1776, in the early years before the Declaration of Independence, people were still toasting, God Save the King. So, faithful British subjects. And even during the Revolution, a significant portion of the population stayed loyal to the crown. So that being said, a lot of our culture and beliefs come from a tradition that's rooted in Great Britain. Now, there are a lot of people who came from Britain to the Americas in the colonial period. And guys, when I'm talking the colonial period, I'm talking 1607 to 1776. And there are a lot of push factors. Push factors are reasons why people would leave. Different places in the colonies became havens for different people for different reasons. For example, there was a group of separatists who wanted to purify all traces of the Catholic Church from the Anglican Church. And so they were British, and at first they tried going to Holland, but they didn't like that their kids were being Dutchified, the Dutchification of their children, wearing wooden shoes and speaking Dutch. They didn't like that. And so they decided to try to practice their own religious beliefs in a new land. And so they struck a deal with the Virginia Company of London, but blew off course on the way here and landed at a place called Plymouth. And those people were the Pilgrims. And they came for religious reasons. Not necessarily because they were being persecuted, but they wanted to practice the beliefs of their own choosing. They wanted to have a strict purification of the Anglican Church, and that's why they're called Puritans. Okay, and then in 1607, the very first successful British colony was the Virginia Company of London, and they came for no reason whatsoever other than to make money. The Virginia Company of London is a joint stock company, and their sole purpose was to make cash. They were not there for seeking religious freedom. They were not there seeking asylum from persecution or political asylum. They wanted money, and that was the entire purpose of the Jamestown colony, and they found money in the form of tobacco. Now, as all these people are coming to the New World for different reasons and different places at different times, they began to, they're 3,000 miles away from the boss, the king. And so they have a little bit of leeway with how they act and how they treat themselves. They were allowed to, they created their own assemblies. For example, Virginia created the House of Burgesses, where they met and made their own rules and laws and basically governed themselves. Self-government.
Would this be like the first example of self-government in the colonies?
In the colonies, yes. I would say the very first would be, you could go as far back as like the Iroquois League. Mm-hmm. But as far as the European self-government, probably the Mayflower Compact, which was, it was drawn up by the Pilgrims, the Separatists. And the reason why they did is because they thought they were going to Virginia. But they didn't land in Virginia. And their charter was for them to be in Virginia. Well, they weren't in Virginia. And so they wanted to create some rules before they went ashore on how to live their lives. Self-government. But, that's a pretty common aspect of these early colonists is being able to rule themselves and, fundamental rules and laws by which how they're going to operate. And they still had the absolute authority of the king was there in Europe, in England, but not in the colonies. It was absent in the colonies. And plus, land was abundant. I mean, land was everywhere. It seemed to be almost infinite. Even today, America is largely a rural nation. Still haven't, settled it all. So, Great Britain was really not part of the everyday, in-your-face life of the colonies. And, although religion was central to the lives of a lot of the colonists, there was still no single state church that existed, like in England, with the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. So the colonists did not follow the British practice of your required tithing, or you were required to pay a certain amount of your money to the church in the form of taxes, which is a state-supported church, which you would imagine leads a people to have a little separation in church and state, which is something that's an American idea. So, there was a lot of reasons why people came. And you can see how these things are kind of setting the stage for future things that happen. Okay? All right, next little bit is on these. This is still the colonies. Great Britain established an economic system called mercantilism. And they didn't just do it with the American colonies. They did it up until the 1940s when their empire came to an end, where they tried to create a favorable balance of trade to make themselves rich and exploit the resources of their colonies, which is what they did here. This is what they did here. The legal way, the actual document that creates this is called the Navigation Acts, which was made in 1651. And what the Navigation Acts are is it's a series of laws passed by the British Parliament to prevent other European powers from trading with the colonies in America. Particularly Britain's greatest commercial rival at that time, Holland, the Dutch. So, Americans were not allowed to trade with the Dutch, or the French, or the Spanish, or the Portuguese, anybody but Great Britain. And being the good British subjects that we were, how did Americans respond to the Navigation Acts?
The Tea Party.
We just totally ignored them.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
We just smuggled from the 1650s up until we became America. Smuggling was one of America's number one pastimes. And we were good at it. And people got extremely wealthy. People like John Hancock. You ever heard of him? Yeah, he was a smuggler. That's how he became one of the wealthiest people in Boston. So, basically, there was so much money being made by the British and by American colonists. Yeah, the Navigation Acts were on the books, but they were largely unenforced. They just kind of ignored them. Everybody ignored them. The British were satisfied with the money that they were bringing in, and the colonists were satisfied with being able to smuggle a little on the side and being wealthy. And I have no idea why it says, what does this word sound like at the bottom of this slide? Please ignore that. All right? But pretty soon, this fragile relationship is going to be put to the test as, more and more pressure gets put on by outside forces, particularly the French. And eventually it's going to break out into really a global war. In the French and Indian War is what we called it in the United States. Globally, it's called the 7 Years' War, but it's the same thing. It was fought from 1756 to 1763. The 7 Years' War was fought from 1756 to 1763. We historians are not that good at math. Fought mainly on the western frontier of the colonies in places like Appalachia and Ohio and in Canada. Most of the global war was initiated by the British, but it was fought literally all over the world. And the two sides fighting were the French and the British. not the French and the Indians. We simply call it the French and Indian War because it was the British colonists versus the French and the Indians. And that's why we refer to it as the French and Indian War. French and Indians were allies against the British. Globally, it's the 7 Years' War, which was France versus Great Britain and their allies. So, ultimately, who wins this war? Who wins the French and Indian War?
The British.
The British, thereby removing the French from the New World. For all intents and purposes, the French are removed. However, this was a very costly conflict. Imagine fighting, having to send your troops all over the planet, fighting and keeping supply lines going and sending more men. It's very costly. So, if you are a government and you need money, what do?
You ask for help.
You tax. You tax. The British thought it was a good idea, and I can't say that I disagree, that the colonists were the ones that were receiving all the benefit of the fighting from the French and Indian War, because all the fighting that took place in the French and Indian War took place in the colonies. And so, therefore, who should be responsible for footing the bill? The colonists. So, Parliament initiated a series of taxes to pay for the war, as well for the expenses of just administering, having royal governors and judges in the colonies. So in the year 1764, after the war was over, Parliament enacted the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act. This was obviously just a tax on, it was actually a tax on sugar, coffee, wine, and other products commonly exported. How did the colonists respond to this tax, this direct tax on those commodities?
Not very well.
Not very well. In fact, they said, you are taxing us and we are not having a voice in government. And so a rallying cry emerged. People would say what? No taxation without representation. And that political cry of no taxation without representation rang out across the colonies. And the British weren't too concerned about it. So, the colonists respond to the Sugar Act and other acts that get passed by boycotting. We're not going to buy sugar. We're not going to buy coffee. We're not going to buy tea. We're not going to buy these commodities. We need coffee, we'll make our own. We'll make it out of chicory. We need sweeten, we'll just put honey in our stuff. And they found alternatives. And they boycotted British goods. What does boycotting do? First off, what is the act of boycotting?
Well, it's you stop using
That's right.
certain service.
That's right. You begin to no longer purchase certain things, all right, and encourage others to stop using them as well. So that's what boycott is. It's organized abstaining from a product, service, or good. So that puts a lot of pressure on the British. How?
Because they're not getting any money.
And so who is that putting the pressure on? If the American colonists are putting who are the American colonists putting pressure on if they're not buying stuff?
The system of trade.
Merchants. Yeah, the people that own the stuff they're selling, the shippers, the business owners, wealthy British citizens. What do the wealthy British citizens say? Are they just going to say, oh, okay, no big deal?
No.
Who are they going to be upset?
Yeah.
Are they going to complain? Who are they going to complain to?
The British government?
The British government, Parliament. And guess what Parliament does?
They pass another one?
They say, okay, we withdraw. No more Sugar Act. You win. However, we're going to put a little thing in there that says even though we're not taxing you for this stuff, we still have complete and utter authority over you. All right? And Americans were like, whatever, we ain't paying taxes, party. All right? So we found out about that, and that made us very happy. It made us very happy. So time goes on, and a new prime minister comes to the forefront of the British government. His name was Charles Townshend. Champagne Charlie. And he passes a series of legislation in Parliament called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Acts were pretty offensive to the American colonists. It includes a stamp tax and stamp act. They're going to reinforce the navigation acts. So all the smuggling is going to be lessened a lot because now they're going to start to enforce them. How do you enforce the navigation acts? How do you get people to stop smuggling? How would you do it? If you're the government, you got these people 3,000 miles away, how are you going to stop them from smuggling? And in order to do that, what do you need? Okay, money and what else? You just say, hey, you guys, don't smuggle.
No, you have to enforce.
You have to enforce with what? People. So did the British have to send people here? Are they going to put them up in 5-star hotels? Where are they going to let them sleep? They're going to let them sleep in the people's houses. And they pass a law that allows them to do that called the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act. So if you're a British or American colonist, all of a sudden your smuggling's going down. The price of your stuff at the store is going up. And now you got all these British soldiers running around your neighborhood, swearing, cussing, flirting with your women, taking your job. How do you feel about that? Angry. You feel upset about it. And so more boycotts begin to arrive, and organized efforts to oppose the British begin to rise up. And organizations begin to form, like the Sons of Liberty, led by people like Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty, and the Daughters of Liberty. These responses came almost immediately, and protesters announced another boycott of tea. And then an event happens which galvanizes the people of the Northeast, particularly in the city of Boston. British soldiers, roughly 4,000 of them, were sent to the city of Boston, which had one of the largest harbors in the New World. And these 4,000 soldiers were quartered in people's homes. They weren't paid regularly by the crown, and so they had to get jobs to survive. And so therefore that creates more competition for jobs amongst the citizens of Boston. So the people of Boston hate them. They hate them. And it was not an uncommon thing to see the people of Boston taunt and poke fun at and toss things and scream at and make fun of British soldiers. But on March the 5th, 1770, an event happens which is pretty well propagandized. 1770. March the 5th, 1770. At this time, some British soldiers were in guard at the tax house, the place where the taxes were collected, the tax collector's hall. And that particular evening, a mob formed and began to throw snowballs and oyster shells and rocks and feces and clubs at the guards who were posted up outside. And, it just so happened that one of these guards got hit in the head really hard, and the guards started to be fearful for their life. And so they opened fire on the mob of American colonists. the British soldiers shot the colonists. Well, you don't hear about, the colonists mocking them and throwing oyster shells and rocks and clubs. All you hear is, according to this picture on the left, which was a lithograph made by silversmith Paul Revere, is that the British massacred poor, helpless, innocent American colonists for no reason whatsoever. It's not the greatest picture, but the looks on the faces of the soldiers, they're all angry and mean, and snarling. And then the angelic look on the faces of the colonists with blood pouring from their wounds, including one of the men who was killed, whose name was Crispus Attucks. He was actually a black man living in Boston. And the troops killed 5 colonists. And this event becomes known as the Boston Massacre, when it really should be called the Boston Self-Defense. But following this confrontation, people were very upset. And Parliament did respond. And they lifted all duties. No more taxes on anything. All the Townshend Act. Except for one tax on tea. And this tea tax continued to be a symbolic irritant to the colonies. So, the Sons of Liberty, at the suggestion of Samuel Adams, they go throughout the other colonies and create an organization by which they can communicate with one another quickly. And this is referred to as the Committees of Correspondence. And what this is a way the colonies can stay in touch with one another about the developments with the British and how the British are treating the colonies and infringing upon their rights. The Committees of Correspondence. There were no text messages. There really wasn't even postal service. But what this created was a way in which messages could travel quicker about movements of British. And eventually that becomes important, especially when the British soldiers are marching around trying to kill colonists, because they can inform people in a much faster way. So, despite the dissent of the British over treatment of the colonies, Parliament passed the tea, that we still have that tax on tea. All right, but all the other taxes are lifted, and the tea tax was minuscule. It wasn't even that bad, okay? But the very symbol that the British could tax the colonies without any representation in Parliament was still distasteful. In fact, it was becoming to where the people in the colonies were so glad that they had this tea tax because the tea that they were buying was so cheap. It was cheaper than smuggled tea, even with the tax on it. So, this puts the Sons of Liberty in a bit of a bind because they don't want people to buy British tea because that means that they're willing to submit themselves to this British taxation without representation. So, when the British show up, the East India Trading Company show up with an enormous boatload of British tea in December of 1773, I believe. The Sons of Liberty, who had spent a significant portion of their day at the Green Dragon drinking, thought it would be a good idea to dress up like Indians, board the ship, and throw it all in the ocean, in the harbor. This event is now referred to as the Boston Tea Party. Well, this does not go over very well with Parliament and definitely does not go over very well to King George III. How do you think King George III is going to react to this news?
He is going to get revenge.
That is the perfect word. Retaliation, revenge. First of all, you look at it from King George's perspective. They have an enormous amount of debt from a war that they fought in the colonies to protect the colonies. The colonies are refusing to pay taxes. The colonies are boycotting British goods, thereby putting pressure on British merchants, who are thereby putting pressure on the Parliament and the King. The King and the Parliament both succumb to their wishes and say, look, we're just not going to tax you anymore, but it's a minuscule tax. And then, after doing what the colonists want and repealing all the taxes, and then you go to sell some tea that's very cheap, even cheaper than the smuggled tea, and the colonists dump it all in the harbor. How would you feel, King Nick, Queen Aurora? How would you guys feel?
I would want to retaliate.
You would be upset. Don't you feel as though you're doing everything you can to help these people?
Yeah.
How do you think King George felt?
He felt like he was doing the best he could.
Like you bunch of spoiled little brats. And that's what we are, Americans. Okay? So he begins to put some pretty harsh restrictions on the American colonies. For example, we call them the intolerable acts, but technically they're the coercive acts in 1774. What this does is it closes down Boston Harbor, thereby basically putting the entire city of Boston into unemployment and in poverty. The Quartering Act is to be re-upped and reinforced because he's going to, in order to shut down a harbor, it has to be manned 24 hours a day by soldiers. So more soldiers are being sent to the New World, and they're going to be living with people. So, in response to these intolerable acts, what did the Americans do?
They retaliated even more?
With what? We meet.
Oh,
We have a meeting.
Okay.
The First Continental Congress, comprised of 56 delegates, a delegate from every colony except Georgia, and a couple things happen. Basically, it's just a big gas bag convention. They just talk. But they do establish a formal organization to boycott. They're going to continue to boycott British goods. So you're not allowed to buy anything British. That means fabric or food or tea or coffee or clothing or furniture. You cannot buy anything British. And they let it be known throughout the colonies that you're not to buy anything British. How do you enforce that? How do you enforce it?
You could say, hey, if you buy this product,
Mhm.
if another colony buys it, we won't trade with you.
Okay, maybe.
That's what they use.
Well, how do you make an individual citizen stop buying a certain product? How about this? You make a public spectacle of them and torture them in public with tarring and feathering. Like, oh, I see you bought some tea from the British store over there. Guess who's going to be on display being made fun of for all day? If you're in the community and you see that, how likely are you to go buy some of that tea? Unlikely. So we use violence against each other. Also a very American trait. We like to be violent toward one another. A trait that's as American as, we're doing it before we're even a country. Tarring and feathering your brother and sister neighbors. My, how things have changed. Also at the First Continental Congress, they draw up a Declaration of Rights and Resolved. And what happens here is the colonists, basically they're like, hey, look, man, look, King, here's our problems. Can you fix it, dude? Can you help us out? Here's what we want. It's nothing that major. And we'll stop doing all this stuff. And we'll go back to drinking God Save the King. We love you, man. But can you help us out? That's what the Declaration of Rights and Resolves basically is. It's a letter to the king.
It's not an olive branch.
This is not the olive branch
But
petition.
it's like an olive branch.
It is like an olive
Yeah,
branch.
that's just not it.
Right. It is like a peace. Of course, there's been no fighting yet. There's been no real violence yet against one another. Just violence against ourselves. So some time goes on. Also, they pick a man to be in charge. And that man is George Washington. George Washington's in charge. He's the commander in chief. Okay. So King George gets his letter, and he refuses to yield. So basically, King George's response is, "Oh, so you guys are the ones causing all this trouble. Not only am I not going to stop what I'm doing, I'm telling you that if you don't stop what you're doing, you are going to be hung by your neck until you are dead for treason. You are not in charge, Continental Congress. You are nobody. I am the King of England, and you will do what I say." That being said, how do you think the American colonists in the Continental Congress felt?
We have another Congress.
They're going to have another one because now, in the words of Benjamin Franklin, they must all hang together or they will all hang separately. So they deemed it necessary that it's time for us to come together. We are no longer 13 individual colonies, but we are one group of people fighting for our natural rights to be independent. So King George III refuses to yield. The Second Continental Congress meets again in Philadelphia. And before it could meet, fighting broke out. Fighting broke out in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. In Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. With what American writer and philosopher said later, Ralph Waldo Emerson, he called it the shot heard round the world, because that is what started the American Revolution. And basically, at Lexington, the guy who was in charge of Boston, his name was General Thomas Gage, British guy, bad guy. He was desperate to find Sam Adams and John Hancock. He hated those guys because they were like the ringleaders. He wanted to hunt them down and capture them and find out where all the hidden cannons were and all the gunpowder they had stored up. He wanted to capture it and arrest those two guys. He hears about a storage cache of weapons and munitions and that Hancock and Adams might be in Lexington. He sends some troops to Lexington. The troops are met by some American colonists there, and the British troops just basically annihilate them. Okay, it's the massacre there. All right, but a few of them escape and they run to Concord, and then they tell the people at Concord that hey, these British are on their way here. And by the time the British made it to Concord, these Minutemen had set up posts and were ready to fight guerrilla style, and the colonists defeat the British at the Battle of Concord. All right, these are the first two battles of the American Revolution. Even after all the fighting, the American colonists are still willing to be British subjects. Even after the fight, there's blood has been shed. And so in a final attempt to avert more bloodshed, the Second Continental Congress sends a letter called the Olive Branch Petition to King George on July the 5th, 1775. Saying, please, end this hostility. We will be faithful subjects. The king responds to this letter by sending an additional 20,000 troops to the New World to stop the rebellion, and also labeling all the people in attendance at the meeting to be traitors, and if captured, they are subject to death. So the Olive Branch Petition also goes a long way to galvanizing the people in the colonies. So at this point, it becomes pretty clear what the colonies have to do. And a man by the name of Thomas Paine sets out to do it, and that's what we will talk about next week. So if you guys that are home, make sure that you do your vocabulary tomorrow. Your Friday assignment is Chapter 2 vocabulary. There's 26 words, and the definitions are on the side of the pages in your book. You don't even have to use the glossary. Okie doke. If you have questions, don't hesitate to give me a shout on Schoology or email. Have a great weekend.